Michelle Thompson was not someone who enjoyed the spotlight. She was a hard-working, down-to-earth woman in her early 30s who had built a successful career as a marketing consultant. Her life revolved around meeting deadlines, attending conferences, and delivering results for her clients. On this particular day, Michelle had just finished a high-stakes business conference in New York City. It had been an exhausting week of networking events, presentations, and late-night strategy sessions. But now, with her work done, she was ready to board her flight back home to Los Angeles and finally relax. As Michelle arrived at the airport, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. The bustling terminal was filled with travelers rushing to their gates, families saying goodbye, and the faint hum of announcements echoing through the halls. She checked in her luggage, grabbed a quick coffee from a nearby cafe, and headed toward her gate. Everything seemed normal, just another routine trip. Little did she know that this journey would soon turn into something far from ordinary. When Michelle reached the boarding area, she noticed something unusual about her ticket. Printed clearly on the boarding pass was a note indicating a complimentary seat upgrade to first class. Michelle blinked twice, thinking there might be some mistake. She wasn't complaining, though. Her company occasionally rewarded its top performers with perks like this, and it looked like today was her lucky day. Smiling to herself, she tucked the boarding pass into her bag and prepared to board the plane. The queue moved quickly, and soon Michelle found herself stepping onto the aircraft. The interior of the plane gleamed under the soft cabin lights, and the familiar scent of polished leather and fresh air greeted her. As she walked down the narrow aisle, she couldn't help but feel a small thrill at the thought of sitting in the luxurious first-class section for the first time in months. But as Michelle approached her assigned seat, she noticed something odd. A flight attendant standing near the entrance to the first-class cabin gave her a long, curious look. This wasn't the usual warm smile or polite nod passengers typically received. It was more like a scrutinizing glare. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Sarah, stepped forward and addressed Michelle in a tone that was anything but welcoming. "Excuse me, ma'am," Sarah said, her voice carrying a hint of skepticism. "Are you sure this is your seat?" Michelle paused, slightly taken aback by the question. She pulled out her boarding pass and showed it to Sarah. "Yes, this is my seat," she replied calmly, pointing to the printed details. Sarah glanced at the boarding pass, then back at Michelle, her expression unchanged. Instead of offering an apology or moving aside, Sarah continued to hover, her body language suggesting disbelief. "Well, I'll need to double-check that," Sarah said, taking the boarding pass from Michelle's hand. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward the front of the plane, presumably to verify the information. Michelle stood there awkwardly, feeling the weight of Sarah's gaze lingering even after she had left. Passengers behind her began to shuffle impatiently, muttering under their breath about the delay. A few moments later, Sarah returned, handing the boarding pass back to Michelle. "It seems everything checks out," she said stiffly, though her tone implied otherwise. Michelle nodded politely, trying to brush off the encounter as nothing more than a minor inconvenience. She took her seat, stowed her carry-on bag, and settled in, hoping to put the incident behind her. However, Sarah's behavior didn't end there. Over the next several minutes, Michelle noticed that the flight attendant seemed unusually attentive, perhaps overly so. Every time Sarah passed by, she made pointed comments about trivial things such as how Michelle should adjust her seatbelt or where exactly her bag needed to be placed in the overhead compartment. Each remark came across as unnecessarily critical, and Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that she was being singled out. Other passengers began to take notice too. Some exchanged glances, while others whispered quietly among themselves. One older gentleman seated across the aisle gave Michelle a sympathetic look, shaking his head slightly as if to say, "This isn't right." Despite the growing tension, Michelle chose to stay composed. She reminded herself that arguing wouldn't solve anything and resolved to focus on the upcoming flight instead. Still, deep down, Michelle couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. Something about Sarah's attitude felt off, almost personal. Was it because of her casual attire, Or maybe her natural hairstyle. Whatever the reason, Michelle knew one thing for certain. This was shaping up to be a very uncomfortable journey. And as the plane taxied down the runway preparing for takeoff, Michelle couldn't help but wonder what other surprises awaited her on this seemingly routine flight. As the plane soared higher into the sky, Michelle tried her best to push aside the earlier unpleasantness with Sarah. She leaned back in her plush first-class seat, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. This was supposed to be a relaxing flight, a chance to unwind after a grueling week of work. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on calming thoughts, Sarah's behavior kept replaying in her mind like a broken record. Michelle had flown hundreds of times before, both in economy and business class, but she had never experienced anything quite like this. Sure, there were occasional rude passengers or frazzled airline staff, but those incidents usually stemmed from stress or misunderstandings. What happened just moments ago felt different, deliberate even. It wasn't simply about checking a boarding pass. It was as if Sarah doubted Michelle belonged in first class based solely on her appearance. The tension escalated when Sarah returned to the cabin shortly after takeoff. Instead of tending to other passengers, she lingered near Michelle's row, making unnecessary adjustments to the overhead bins and rearranging items that didn't seem out of place. Her movements were exaggerated, almost theatrical, as though she wanted everyone around her to notice what she was doing. Every time Michelle glanced up, Sarah avoided eye contact, choosing instead to busy herself with trivial tasks. Then came the moment that made Michelle's stomach drop. Over the intercom, Sarah announced in a clipped tone, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have identified a minor issue with one of our seating arrangements. Please bear with us while we resolve it quickly." Passengers exchanged puzzled looks, unsure of what the announcement meant. Michelle, however, immediately sensed that something was wrong, and she feared she might be at the center of it. Moments later, a man dressed in an impeccably tailored navy blue suit appeared in the aisle, accompanied by another flight attendant. He carried himself with confidence, exuding an air of privilege that seemed almost rehearsed. His polished shoes clicked against the floor as he approached Michelle's row. When he reached her seat, he stopped and flashed Sarah a knowing smile before turning his attention to Michelle. "Excuse me," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with charm. "It seems I've been assigned to this seat." Michelle stared at him, momentarily speechless. She glanced at Sarah, who stood nearby with her arms crossed, looking smug. For a brief second, Michelle considered arguing, pointing out that she had already been seated here and confirmed her upgrade. But before she could say anything, Sarah jumped in, addressing the situation in a way that left little room for debate. "I'm so sorry for the confusion," Sarah said, her tone overly sweet, yet laced with condescension. "Our system must have made an error. This gentleman is entitled to the seat, and unfortunately—" She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. For Michelle, the message was clear. She didn't belong here. Not because of any technical glitch, but because someone like her, a black woman wearing jeans and sneakers, didn't fit the image Sarah expected of a first-class passenger. The injustice of it all hit her like a punch to the gut. Here she was, a paying customer whose company had paid top dollar for her ticket, being treated as though she were an imposter. Other passengers began whispering among themselves, their reactions ranging from confusion to outright disbelief. A young woman sitting diagonally across from Michelle leaned forward slightly, her brow furrowed. "That doesn't seem fair," she murmured to her companion. Nearby, an older couple exchanged disapproving glances, clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Even the man in the suit shifted uneasily in his new seat, perhaps sensing that he was part of something deeply wrong. Despite the growing unease around her, Michelle refused to let anger consume her. She knew losing her temper wouldn't solve anything. It would only give Sarah more ammunition to paint her as difficult or unreasonable. Instead, she gathered her belongings calmly, ensuring not to make a scene. As she stood up to move, she locked eyes with Sarah, allowing her gaze to convey everything she couldn't put into words. There was hurt there, yes, but also strength. A quiet determination that said, "You can humiliate me now, but this isn't over." Once Michelle relocated to her new seat in the economy section, she pulled out her phone and opened a note-taking app. With steady hands, she jotted down every detail of the encounter, the names, the timeline, the subtle digs, and overt dismissals. She knew better than most how important documentation was when dealing with corporate entities. If the airline thought they could sweep this under the rug, they were sorely mistaken. For the rest of the flight, Michelle kept to herself, staring out the window as clouds drifted past. Inside, however, her mind raced. She replayed each interaction, analyzing Sarah's words and actions, searching for clues about why this had happened. Was it racism, classism, or simply a toxic combination of both? Whatever the reason, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't an isolated incident. Airlines often prided themselves on exclusivity, catering to wealthy clientele who demanded perfection at every turn. And in industries like these, people who didn't fit the mold were frequently pushed aside without a second thought. When the plane finally touched down in Los Angeles, Michelle felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Relief that the ordeal was over, but also frustration that she'd been forced to endure it in the first place. As she disembarked, she caught one last glimpse of Sarah, who was chatting animatedly with a coworker near the exit. Their laughter grated against Michelle's ears, a stark reminder of the disconnect between them. Standing in the terminal, Michelle paused for a moment, clutching her carry-on bag tightly. She knew she had two choices: let the incident slide and pretend it never happened, or fight back and demand accountability. For someone like Michelle, who had spent years advocating for fairness and equality in her professional life, the decision was obvious. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation. With renewed resolve, Michelle powered on her phone and dialed the airline's customer service number. When the YAO representative answered, she launched into a detailed recounting of the events, leaving nothing out. Her voice remained calm and measured, but beneath the surface her words carried a weight that demanded attention. By the time she hung up, Michelle felt a flicker of hope. The battle was far from over, but at least the wheels were in motion. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would spark conversations far beyond the confines of an airplane cabin. After ending the call with the airline's customer service representative, Michelle stepped out of the terminal and into the warm Los Angeles sunshine. The city buzzed around her, cars honking, people chatting on their phones, and the faint hum of planes descending overhead. But Michelle barely noticed any of it. Her mind was consumed by what had just transpired during that phone call. While the representative had listened politely, their response had been lukewarm at best. "I'm sorry to hear about your experience," the agent had said in a tone that sounded rehearsed. "We'll look into this matter further, but please understand that these kinds of errors are rare." Rare? Michelle thought bitterly as she walked toward the baggage claim area. If they considered racial profiling and blatant discrimination rare, then clearly the airline wasn't paying attention to the bigger picture. It wasn't just about one flight attendant or one seating mix-up. It was about systemic issues that allowed such behavior to happen in the first place. Determined not to let the issue fade away quietly, Michelle decided to take matters into her own hands. She pulled out her laptop once she got home and began drafting a detailed post for social media. Over the years, Michelle had built a modest following online, mostly through sharing insights from her career and occasional motivational posts. This time, however, she wanted her words to resonate far beyond her usual audience. She titled her post, "When Your Seat Isn't Just a Seat, a Story of Discrimination at 35,000 Feet." In the post, Michelle recounted every detail of the incident, the dismissive attitude, the forced reassignment, and the underlying prejudice she believed fueled Sarah's actions. She included screenshots of her boarding pass and even photos of her casual outfit, pointing out how absurd it was to judge someone's worthiness based on clothing or appearance. To ensure transparency, Michelle refrained from naming the airline directly, instead referring to it as a major carrier, while subtly hinting at its identity. Before hitting publish, Michelle hesitated. Sharing personal experiences publicly always carried risks, misinterpretation, backlash, or even threats, but something inside her whispered that staying silent would be worse. With a deep breath, she clicked the button and watched as her post went live. Within minutes, comments started flooding in. Friends and acquaintances expressed shock and outrage, offering messages of support and encouragement. Then came strangers, people who didn't know Michelle personally, but connected deeply with her story. One commenter wrote, "This happened to me too. I was traveling with my family and we were treated like criminals because of our skin color." Another added, "Thank you for speaking up. So many of us have been through similar situations but didn't know how to fight back." The post quickly gained traction, spreading across platforms like wildfire. Within hours, it had thousands of likes, shares, and retweets. News outlets picked up the thread, reaching out to Michelle for interviews. Journalists called her a symbol of resilience and praised her for shedding light on an issue that affected countless travelers worldwide. For Michelle, the sudden attention was overwhelming, but also validating. She realized she wasn't alone. Her story was part of a much larger conversation about inequality in everyday spaces. Meanwhile, the airline scrambled to respond. They released a generic statement via email to Michelle, apologizing for any inconvenience caused and promising to investigate the matter internally. However, the apology lacked sincerity and failed to address the core issue of discrimination. When Michelle shared the airline's response online, it only fueled more criticism. People accused the company of being performative rather than genuinely committed to change. As the days passed, Michelle became increasingly aware of the power of her voice. She started receiving messages from advocacy groups and organizations focused on combating racism and bias. Many invited her to speak at events or collaborate on campaigns aimed at holding corporations accountable. At first, Michelle hesitated. She wasn't an activist by trade, nor did she seek fame. But the more she reflected on her experience, the more she felt compelled to use her platform for good. One evening, Michelle sat down with a cup of tea and drafted a list of goals. She wanted to push the airline to implement real changes, not just empty promises. She envisioned sensitivity training programs for employees, stricter policies against discriminatory behavior, and greater transparency when addressing complaints. She also hoped to inspire others to speak up when faced with injustice, no matter how intimidating it might seem. To amplify her message, Michelle partnered with a prominent civil rights organization to launch a petition calling for accountability. Within the airline industry, within days, the petition garnered tens of thousands of signatures. Celebrities, influencers, and activists joined the cause, using their platforms to spread awareness. Hashtags like #FlyWithRespect and #WendAirlineBias trended globally, sparking debates about inclusivity and privilege in travel. Back at the airline's headquarters, executives found themselves under intense scrutiny. Shareholders demanded answers, employees voiced concerns about workplace culture, and customers threatened boycotts. The pressure mounted so heavily that the CEO scheduled an emergency meeting with senior leadership to discuss next steps. Behind closed doors, tempers flared as team members argued over whether the company should admit fault or continue deflecting blame. While all of this unfolded, Michelle remained steadfast. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change rarely came without resistance, especially in industries as entrenched in tradition as aviation. But she refused to back down. Every comment, every share, and every signature reminded her that she wasn't fighting alone. Thousands of people stood beside her, united by a shared desire for justice. One particularly memorable moment came when a journalist asked Michelle during an interview, "What do you hope comes out of this?" Michelle paused, reflecting carefully before answering. "I hope companies realize that treating people with dignity isn't optional. It's essential," she said firmly. "And I hope anyone who's ever felt marginalized knows they have the power to stand up and make noise. Together we can create a world where everyone feels respected, regardless of where they sit on a plane." Her words resonated deeply, striking a chord with viewers around the globe. For many, Michelle's courage served as a catalyst, a reminder that individual voices could spark collective action. As the movement grew, so did Michelle's determination. She wasn't just seeking restitution for herself. She was fighting for a future where stories like hers wouldn't exist anymore. By the end of the week, Michelle had transformed from a private individual into a public figure, a reluctant hero thrust into the spotlight by circumstances beyond her control. Yet despite the whirlwind of attention, she stayed grounded, focusing on the bigger picture. The battle was far from over, but Michelle knew one thing for certain: silence was no longer an option, and neither was complacency. As the days turned into weeks, the story of Michelle Thompson and her humiliating experience on the flight continued to dominate headlines. The airline found itself at the center of a media storm, with journalists digging deeper into its practices and policies. What started as an isolated incident quickly unraveled into something much larger, a glaring spotlight on systemic issues within the company. Investigative reporters began uncovering troubling patterns that painted a disturbing picture. Internal documents leaked online revealed that the airline had long prioritized exclusivity over inclusivity, often catering to wealthy clientele who expected nothing less than perfection. These revelations included memos from senior management, emphasizing the importance of maintaining a certain image for first-class passengers. According to these documents, employees were encouraged, sometimes even pressured, to enforce strict standards, which inadvertently led to discriminatory behavior against those deemed out of place. One particularly damning piece of evidence came in the form of an email chain between executives discussing partnerships with luxury brands. One such partnership involved a high-end fashion label known for its glamorous runway shows and elite customer base. The email suggested that this collaboration hinged not only on shared marketing goals, but also on the airline's ability to uphold a perception of exclusivity. In simpler terms, the airline was expected to ensure that first-class cabins remained a space reserved for people who fit a very specific mold, one that excluded individuals like Michelle. When news of this partnership broke, public outrage reached new heights. Critics accused the airline of commodifying privilege while ignoring the human cost of such elitism. Social media exploded with hashtags like exclusivity as discrimination and stop corporate bias, further amplifying calls for accountability. People argued that businesses shouldn't be allowed to profit off exclusionary practices, especially when those practices perpetuated racism and inequality. The fashion brand, caught off guard by the backlash, scrambled to distance itself from the controversy. Known for championing diversity and inclusion in its advertising campaigns, the company issued a strongly worded statement condemning the airline's actions. "We believe in creating spaces where everyone feels welcome and valued," the statement read. "It has come to our attention that our partner does not share these values. As a result, we have decided to terminate our collaboration effective immediately." The decision sent shockwaves through the industry. The partnership had been worth millions of dollars annually, making it one of the airline's most lucrative deals. By cutting ties, the fashion brand signaled that ethical considerations outweighed financial gain, a bold move that resonated with consumers worldwide. For Michelle, the termination felt like a small victory. She had never imagined her story would lead to such significant consequences, but she couldn't help feeling conflicted. While justice was being served, the emotional toll of reliving the incident still lingered. Meanwhile, the airline faced mounting pressure from advocacy groups, shareholders, and even former employees. Whistleblowers came forward, sharing their own accounts of bias and mistreatment within the organization. One former flight attendant described how she had been reprimanded for allowing a passenger in casual attire to board a premium cabin without question. Another recounted being told during training sessions that certain hairstyles or cultural attire might distract other passengers and should therefore be discouraged. These testimonies added fuel to the fire, prompting lawmakers to call for investigations into the airline's hiring and training practices. Congressional hearings were scheduled, with representatives vowing to hold the company accountable for fostering a culture of discrimination. The CEO, once confident in his leadership, now appeared visibly shaken during press conferences, struggling to defend decisions made under his watch. Amid the chaos, Michelle found herself thrust further into the limelight. Advocacy groups invited her to speak at rallies and panel discussions, eager to amplify her voice. At first, Michelle hesitated, unsure if she was ready to take on such a prominent role. But as she listened to others share their stories eerily similar to hers, she realized she had a responsibility to keep pushing for change. One evening, Michelle attended a virtual town hall organized by a coalition of civil rights organizations. Hundreds of participants tuned in, eager to hear from survivors of discrimination and experts advocating for reform. When it was Michelle's turn to speak, she took a deep breath and addressed the audience with quiet determination. "What happened to me wasn't just about one flight attendant or one bad day," she said. "It was about systems designed to exclude people based on arbitrary criteria rooted in prejudice and stereotypes. We can't fix this overnight, but we can start by holding companies accountable and demanding transparency." Her words struck a chord, earning thunderous applause from attendees. Many praised her courage, calling her a beacon of hope in the fight against institutionalized bias. Others thanked her for giving them the strength to share their own experiences. For Michelle, the support was overwhelming but also empowering. She knew she wasn't alone anymore. Back at the airline, efforts to mitigate the damage proved futile. Despite issuing multiple apologies and pledging to review internal policies, the company struggled to regain trust. Passengers canceled flights, en masse opting for competitors perceived as more inclusive. Employee morale plummeted as workers grappled with guilt, fear, and uncertainty about the future. Even loyal customers expressed disappointment, questioning whether they could continue supporting a brand tainted by scandal. Sarah, the flight attendant at the heart of the controversy, quietly resigned amid the fallout. Rumors circulated that she had difficulty finding employment elsewhere due to the negative publicity surrounding her role in the incident. Some speculated that she regretted her actions, though she never publicly commented on the matter. For Michelle, Sarah's fate served as a sobering reminder of the ripple effects caused by unchecked prejudice. While she harbored no ill will toward Sarah, she hoped the experience would teach others to think twice before acting on biases. As the dust began to settle, Michelle reflected on everything that had transpired. The journey had been emotionally exhausting, filled with moments of doubt and frustration. Yet it had also been transformative, forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths about society and her place within it. Through her advocacy work, Michelle discovered a newfound sense of purpose, one that extended far beyond her initial goal of seeking justice for herself. While the battle was far from over, Michelle knew she had already achieved something remarkable. Her story had sparked a global conversation about privilege, bias, and accountability. It had inspired countless others to speak up and demand better, not just from airlines, but from all institutions that claimed to value equality. And though scars remained, they served as reminders of battles fought and victories won. For Michelle, the road ahead promised challenges, but also opportunities. Opportunities to reshape industries, challenge norms, and create a world where everyone felt seen, heard, and respected. As she closed her laptop after another day of meetings and interviews, she allowed herself a small smile. Change was possible, and she was determined to see it through. The weeks following the scandal marked a turning point, not just for Michelle, but for the entire airline industry. The controversy had exposed deep-rooted issues that could no longer be ignored or swept under the rug. For the first time in years, conversations about racism, bias, and inclusivity dominated boardroom discussions across major corporations. The airline at the center of the storm was forced to confront its failings head-on, while other companies scrambled to review their own practices to avoid similar scrutiny. Under immense pressure from advocacy groups, lawmakers, and the public, the airline's leadership announced sweeping reforms aimed at fostering a more inclusive environment. In an unprecedented move, the CEO held a press conference to outline these changes. Standing before a room filled with reporters, he began by acknowledging the pain caused by his company's actions, or lack thereof. "We failed you," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. We failed our employees, our passengers, and most importantly, we failed Ms. Michelle Thompson, whose courage has sparked this necessary reckoning. Today, I pledge to make meaningful changes, not because it's good business, but because it's the right thing to do. The proposed reforms included mandatory diversity training for all staff members, revised hiring policies to ensure equal opportunities, and the creation of an independent task force dedicated to addressing discrimination complaints. Additionally, the airline promised to implement stricter accountability measures for employees found guilty of biased behavior. These steps were met with cautious optimism. Critics praised the effort, but warned that true progress would require consistent action, not just promises. Behind the scenes, however, implementing these changes proved challenging. Some employees resisted the new initiatives, dismissing them as unnecessary or overly political. Others expressed frustration, feeling unfairly blamed for systemic issues they hadn't created. To address these concerns, the airline launched internal workshops designed to educate workers about unconscious bias and its impact on workplace culture. Facilitators encouraged open dialogue, allowing employees to share their perspectives and ask difficult questions. For Michelle, watching the airline's transformation unfold was both gratifying and bittersweet. On one hand, she felt proud knowing her story had prompted such significant change. On the other hand, the emotional scars of the incident still lingered. Every news article, every interview request, and every social media comment reminded her of the humiliation she'd endured. Yet despite the weight of it all, Michelle refused to let bitterness consume her. Instead, she channeled her energy into advocacy work, determined to turn her pain into purpose. She collaborated closely with organizations focused on combating racial bias and promoting inclusivity in travel. Together, they developed educational materials for airlines, hotels, and other hospitality businesses, emphasizing the importance of treating every customer with dignity and respect. Michelle also traveled extensively, delivering powerful speeches at conferences and community events. Her talks often centered around themes of resilience, empathy, and the power of collective action. One particularly memorable event took place at a National Civil Rights Summit in Washington, D.C. As Michelle stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause. She smiled warmly, taking a moment to acknowledge the support before launching into her speech. "When I boarded that plane months ago, I didn't expect my life to change forever," she began, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. "I was just another traveler looking forward to going home after a long week of work. But what happened to me wasn't just about one bad day. It was about systems designed to exclude people who don't fit a certain mold. Systems that tell us some lives matter more than others." Pausing briefly, Michelle scanned the crowd, meeting the eyes of those seated closest to the stage. "I'm here today because silence is no longer an option. When we see injustice, we must speak up. When we witness discrimination, we must demand better. And when we have the chance to create change, we must seize it, for ourselves, for our children, and for future generations." Her words resonated deeply, earning a standing ovation from attendees. Many approached her afterward, thanking her for her bravery and sharing their own stories of marginalization. For Michelle, these interactions reinforced her belief in the importance of storytelling as a tool for healing and empowerment. As the movement gained momentum, Michelle became a symbol of hope for countless individuals who had faced similar challenges. Social media platforms buzzed with messages of gratitude, with users tagging her in posts about overcoming adversity. One viral tweet read, "Michelle Thompson didn't just fight for herself, she fought for all of us. Because of her, I know my voice matters too." While the spotlight brought opportunities, it also came with challenges. Trolls and skeptics tried to undermine Michelle's credibility, accusing her of exaggerating the incident or seeking attention. Some even questioned whether she had fabricated parts of her story for personal gain. Despite the negativity, Michelle remained unfazed. She knew criticism was inevitable when tackling deeply entrenched societal issues, and she chose to focus on the positive impact her efforts were making. Back at the airline, the newly established Task Force began reviewing hundreds of discrimination complaints submitted over the years. Each case revealed heartbreaking accounts of exclusion and mistreatment, underscoring the urgent need for reform. The task force worked tirelessly, collaborating with experts in human rights law and organizational psychology to develop comprehensive solutions. Their recommendations ranged from revamping customer service protocols to creating mentorship programs for underrepresented employees. Employees like Sarah, whose actions had ignited the controversy, became cautionary tales within the company. Training sessions frequently referenced her case without naming her, to highlight the consequences of unchecked bias. While some viewed this approach as harsh, others argued it was necessary to drive home the message that discriminatory behavior would no longer be tolerated. For Michelle, the progress made by the airline and the broader industry was a testament to the power of perseverance. Change hadn't come easily, nor quickly, but it had come nonetheless. And though there was still much work to be done, she took solace in knowing that her voice had helped spark a cultural shift. One evening, as Michelle sat on her balcony overlooking the Los Angeles skyline, she reflected on how far she'd come since that fateful flight. The journey had been grueling, filled with moments of doubt and exhaustion. But it had also been transformative, teaching her the value of resilience and the strength found in community. As she gazed at the stars twinkling above, Michelle allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The road ahead promised challenges but also opportunities to inspire, to lead, and to continue fighting for a world where everyone felt seen, heard, and respected. And for now, that was enough. Months had passed since the incident that changed Michelle Thompson's life forever. The airline, once embroiled in scandal, was slowly rebuilding its reputation through the reforms it had pledged to implement. While skepticism lingered among passengers and employees alike, there were signs of progress. Flyers reported friendlier interactions with staff, and new training modules emphasized inclusivity over exclusivity. For Michelle, seeing tangible change gave her a sense of closure, but it also reminded her of how much work remained. The ripple effects of her story extended far beyond the airline industry. Other companies began revisiting their own policies, recognizing the potential risks of ignoring systemic biases. Hotels started offering sensitivity workshops for front desk personnel. Restaurants trained servers to treat all customers equally regardless of appearance or background. And even ride-sharing apps introduced features allowing users to report discriminatory behavior during trips. These shifts may have seemed small individually, but collectively, they signaled a broader cultural awakening, one driven by voices like Michelle's. For Michelle herself, the aftermath of the incident brought both triumphs and challenges. On one hand, she had become an influential advocate for equality, respected not only for her courage but also for her ability to inspire others. Her name appeared in articles alongside civil rights icons, and invitations poured in from organizations eager to collaborate with her. She traveled across the country, speaking at universities, corporate conferences, and community forums about resilience, accountability, and the power of standing up against injustice. But fame came with its own set of burdens. Strangers approached her in public, thanking her for her bravery while sharing their own painful stories of discrimination. While these moments reinforced her purpose, they also weighed heavily on her emotionally. Late at night, when the noise of the world quieted down, Michelle often found herself reflecting on the cost of visibility. Had she chosen this path? No. But she knew walking away wasn't an option, not when so many people depended on her to keep pushing forward. One day, as Michelle prepared for yet another speaking engagement, she received an unexpected email. It was from Sarah, the flight attendant whose actions had sparked the entire ordeal. In the message, Sarah apologized profusely, explaining that she hadn't realized the harm her behavior caused until the backlash unfolded. She admitted feeling ashamed and regretful, adding that losing her job had been a wake-up call. "I hope you can forgive me," Sarah wrote, "because I've spent every day since trying to understand where I went wrong." Michelle read the email several times, her emotions tangled between anger and empathy. Part of her wanted to dismiss Sarah's apology outright, After all, words couldn't undo the damage done. But another part of her recognized that everyone makes mistakes, and growth often begins with accountability. After careful thought, Michelle replied briefly, acknowledging Sarah's remorse without offering absolution. "Thank you for reaching out," she wrote. "I appreciate your willingness to reflect on what happened. My hope is that we can all learn from this experience and do better moving forward." Though Michelle never heard from Sarah again, the exchange left her with a renewed perspective. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, it meant choosing to focus on solutions rather than dwelling on pain, and if Sarah truly intended to grow from her mistakes, then perhaps some good could come from even the darkest chapters of this story. As time went on, Michelle began carving out space for herself outside of advocacy work. She returned to her career as a marketing consultant, channeling her experiences into campaigns promoting diversity and inclusion. Her clients admired her authenticity, and her projects gained recognition for their innovative approaches to tackling social issues. Slowly but surely, Michelle reclaimed pieces of her old life while integrating the lessons she'd learned along the way. Yet, she never stopped advocating for change. When asked during interviews about the key takeaway from her journey, Michelle always responded with the same answer: speak up. Whether it was confronting bias on a plane, addressing inequality in the workplace, or simply challenging harmful stereotypes in everyday conversations, using your voice mattered. Silence, she believed, was complicity, and no one should ever feel powerless in the face of injustice. In the years that followed, Michelle's story continued to resonate with people worldwide. Textbooks featured her as a case study in discussions about racial bias and corporate accountability. Documentaries explored the impact of her activism, highlighting how one person's courage could spark global movements. Even Hollywood expressed interest in adapting her experience into a film, though Michelle declined, preferring to let real-world action speak louder than cinematic portrayals. Looking back, Michelle realized that the most profound lesson she'd learned wasn't about fighting systems of oppression. It was about finding strength within herself. She had entered this journey as a private individual seeking justice, but she emerged as a leader unafraid to challenge the status quo. Along the way, she discovered the importance of community, the value of vulnerability, and the transformative power of resilience. On a crisp autumn morning, Michelle stood before a crowd gathered at a park in downtown Los Angeles. The event was organized by a coalition of grassroots organizations dedicated to advancing equality in travel and hospitality. As she addressed the audience, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen both the worst and best of humanity. "This fight isn't just about seats on planes or privileges in first class," she said, pausing to let her words sink in. "It's about dignity. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of race, gender, age, or socioeconomic status, is treated with respect. Because at the end of the day, we're all just travelers passing through this world. And none of us deserves to feel less worthy than anyone else." Her speech concluded with thunderous applause, echoing across the park like waves crashing against a shore. People lined up afterward to thank her, shaking her hand and hugging her tightly. Among them was a young girl, no older than 10, holding a notebook filled with scribbled notes. "Will you sign this?" the child asked shyly. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Michelle smiled, signing the page with care. As she handed the notebook back, she leaned down and whispered, "You already are. Just remember to use your voice." Walking away from the event later that afternoon, Michelle felt a familiar mix of exhaustion and fulfillment. The road ahead would undoubtedly present new obstacles, but she faced them with unwavering resolve. After all, she had proven something invaluable, not just to others but to herself. That standing up for what's right, no matter how daunting, could create ripples of change capable of transforming the world. And as she drove home beneath a golden sunset, Michelle allowed herself a rare moment of gratitude. For every tear shed, every battle fought, and every victory earned, she knew her journey had been worth it. Because in speaking up, she hadn't just changed industries or policies, she had ignited hope. And hope, she believed, was the most powerful force of all.